dedication to the sport of baseball and your community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the beginning of this year, gas prices were around 96 cents in Halifax. As of this morning, the same price is about $1.22. That's about a third higher in 3 months. Many Nova Scotians might not know that since January 1st, there's been some extra taxes for the carbon pricing scheme in this province on every single litre of gasoline. I'd like to ask the Premier, can the Premier tell Nova Scotians how much his government has collected in carbon price on gasoline since the beginning of the year?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member would know, the price has gone from 15.5 cents to 16.5 cents motor fuel tax on a litre of gas.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was more interested in, at this time in the total amount collected, and just from the information we have available, which is certainly not as much as the government, Mr. Speaker. My back of the envelope math suggests that the government has collected somewhere up to $26 million in additional gas tax revenue out of the pockets of Nova Scotia just since the beginning of the year. But what I can't see in the budget that's just been tabled is a special line item for carbon tax pricing revenue going forward. But if you think about up to $26 million in a quarter, that's a lot of revenue that's buried somewhere in the budget for the coming year. Cannabis tax has its own line, but the carbon pricing revenue doesn't. So if the Premier is so proud of his carbon tax plan, why is he hiding the amount that he's intending to collect? Why can't he put it on display in the budget?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he would know, Mr. Speaker, across the country, carbon tax are coming into many provinces, including some of the sister provinces of Atlantic Canada. We're very fortunate here in Nova Scotia to be able to do our own cap-and-trade system. The Honourable Member referred to the increase in the motor fuel tax. He would also know, Mr. Speaker, that money does not go into general revenue. It goes into the Green Fund that will be made available for initiatives to continue to help Nova Scotians, businesses continue to reduce their carbon footprint. All of that money, Mr. Speaker, will go back into making sure that we continue to green the economy of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we're trying to get an understanding of the size of that Green Fund and the use of that Green Fund. And maybe we'll see it show up in more charging stations in Glaze Bay for all those people driving Teslas, or Inverness, or near Glasgow for all those people driving $80,000 Teslas in those communities. But, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that this government, with this scheme, is collecting more tax money from Nova Scotians. Now, I don't know if this government noticed, but a month ago it was reported that this province has the lowest median after-tax income in the country. So collecting more money from them is something that we should always do cautiously, and we should definitely know what it's going to go for. I mean, $26 million a quarter, up to $26 million a quarter, that's an awfully high price tag for a Justin Trudeau vanity project around the carbon pricing, Mr. Speaker. Does the Premier think that the carbon price on gas is going to increase or decrease in the coming year, and how much does he expect to collect?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've said, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member may want to ignore the fact, Mr. Speaker, that climate change is having an impact on the global community, and our province has a role to play. He can continue to ignore the facts, Mr. Speaker, that he can continue to say the environment doesn't matter. Well, in actual fact, Mr. Speaker, it matters. It's an What we have said, and Canada has taken on its role to ensure that it does its part. What we have said as a provincial government, we want Nova Scotians to be recognized for the work that they have been doing since 2005, Mr. Speaker. The cap-and-trade system inside of Nova Scotia reflects that hard work. It allows us to continue to make investments to ensure that we reduce the carbon footprint of individuals in our Green Fund, Mr. Speaker, and allow business to be able to use that revenue to increase that. But I want to assure the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, that the economy of Nova Scotia is doing well despite all the noise and rhetoric from the honourable member. I want to tell him, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it's pretty important, Mr. Speaker. A.F. Terrio and Sons think it's doing quite well, Mr. Speaker, with a $6.7 million investment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Michelin Tire, in his own riding, Mr. Speaker, believes it's doing well, putting $12 million back into the economy of Pictou County, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell him, Mr. Speaker, Surratt Batteries in Spring Hill believes the economy is doing well. They're making a real investment in the economy of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the economy and the business of Nova Scotia are doing well, despite the honourable member trying to divide communities across this province for his own political need.
The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to express concern about the claim that the economy of Nova Scotia is doing well. I expressed concern about it earlier this week when I asked the Premier if he would respond to the disconnect between the government, the budget that his government had tabled, and the budget of households and families in the province. And the Premier said then this: every trend in the province is headed in the right direction. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is a new addition to the growing body of evidence to the contrary, and I will table it. It's the current issue of the national magazine The Walrus, which contains a cover story about food insecurity in Canada, in which this sentence appears: with nearly 20% of its population affected, Halifax has the highest rate of food insecurity among Canadian cities. Mr. Speaker, this is on every newsstand in Canada. How can the Premier possibly continue to claim that every trend is going in the right direction?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for his question and his leadership to continue to make sure we stay focused on the issues that are important to Nova Scotia families. He's raised each and every time this very issue, and I want to say to him, Mr. Speaker, we have a difference of opinion when it comes to the investments that we have made in those citizens in our community who require our support. Basic personal exemption increase. He would know, Mr. Speaker, that we've removed the fact that child maintenance, Mr. Speaker, is no longer included in when you're looking at whether it's a housing subsidy, whether it's looking at income support. We've removed that, Mr. Speaker. He would also know that we continue to increase the number of rent supplements for low-income Nova Scotians to reduce their overall costs and ensure that they're living in affordable housing, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work, but I want to assure the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, we know there is more work to do. We look forward to hearing his constructive things that we can do together to make sure that we're looking after all of our citizens.
The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party.
The article I've referred to, Mr. Speaker, goes on to say that one of the key reasons that Halifax is the worst city in Canada for people having to skip meals and not being able to afford their food or having to go days without eating. One of the key reasons for that is that many of the jobs Halifax offers are in the service sector, often short-term contract jobs, the kind of jobs that don't come with security or come with benefits. We're talking restaurant staff, cashiers, delivery drivers, janitors, all this essential work that people often do in Nova Scotia for the minimum wage. Mr. Speaker, what makes the Premier think that a mere 55 cents an hour in the minimum wage is going to address the fact that the capital of Nova Scotia is the hunger capital of the country?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for his question. He would know, Mr. Speaker, we're following the model of increasing minimum wage that was set by the Democratic Party when they were in power. This time, Mr. Speaker, though we've increased it to 55 cents this year, it'll get another increase at 55 cents. He knows that is towards the average of minimum wage across the country. I think it's important for the honourable member to recognize that we have seen when minimum wage has increased in respective provinces, it has pushed its way through the salaries, which means, Mr. Speaker, the buying power of that has lasted probably for about 18 months. And then those families were in the same position they were. What we have decided to do, Mr. Speaker, is ensure that we continue to increase the minimum wage. But we've also said at the same time, let's do a sliding scale on basic personal exemption. Mr. Speaker, someone low-income Nova Scotian should not be paying the same basic personal exemptions as the members who sit in this House. I believe that, and I've always believed that, Mr. Speaker. We've changed that. We're leaving more money in the pockets of Nova Scotia. And again, we continue to make sure that we support those families in low-income Nova Scotia who require support with a number of other initiatives, and I look forward to responding to his third question.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier says that there are things that it is important for me to realize. It is important to the people of our province that our Premier recognize the realities of daily life. Now, the article that I'm speaking about profiles a man named John Hammer. John lives in Bayers Westwood. After he pays for his rent, power, phone and medication, he has about $20 a week for groceries. He says in the article how he eats one meal a day, often pasta, sometimes rice, oftentimes a can of soup. Now, one thing that this article makes very clear, one of its contributing experts says, these are the experts' words, food insecurity is about income. So here in the legislature, we have before us a budget which does not include an increase of 1 cent in the poverty reduction credit, the affordable living tax credit, or the Nova Scotia child benefit. How can the Premier not see that he has tabled a budget that is going to leave a lot of people in our province hungry?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. It's the 12th of 17, Mr. Speaker, raised by a widowed parent. Mr. Speaker, I do know the struggles, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotians are feeling today, and it has never left me, Mr. Speaker, when I took this position. That's why every opportunity I get, I wanted to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that basic personal exemption reflect the reality that low-income people in this province should not be paying the same as those of us that sit in this house. It's why I wanted to, why I'm grateful every day, the fact that my parents bought a house before my father passed away, because we had a house to live in. Household insecurity, Mr. Speaker, is a real challenge. It's why we put in place rent supplements to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that low-income Nova Scotians have a place to live. Each and every item in this budget, Mr. Speaker, reflects our commitment to families across this province. Government after government ignored the fact, Mr. Speaker, would continue to use the child maintenance against those families. It was not, Mr. Speaker, income for the person. It was for caring for those children. We have eliminated using that in any of our spaces, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality. Is there more work to do? Of course there is, Mr. Speaker. And I look forward to continuing to work with that member to continue to make sure that the voices continue to be heard of those families that require our support.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Acting Minister of Housing. I've been following announcements made for affordable housing investments, including one last summer that included Cape Breton. Mr. Speaker, but I know sometimes when Communications Nova Scotia puts out releases about Cape Breton, they're not necessarily referring to the entire island. Last fall, I met with a single mom who started a new job in Inverness. Her daughter goes to school in Inverness, and all of her friends are there. They need a place to live in Inverness. Fortunately, they had a place until this spring, at which point it will become a short-term rental for the summer. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, that is fine. I know people are renting properties to visitors to help grow tourism, and that is good, but it means that there's less affordable housing on the market. Surely between last fall and this spring, housing could have found her a place to stay in Inverness. This week, we learned her closest option is over an hour away in Port Hawkesbury. The affordable housing announcements forget about Inverness.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. And Mr. Speaker, the issue raised is a serious one across the province. Why we continue to make sure that we make investments, Mr. in rent subs. It's why in the current budget we have set aside funding to actually invest in our own housing, Mr. Speaker, to make to continue to increase the housing stock that is part of the provinces. We know in some parts of our province, Mr. Speaker, there is the private sector is providing many options for those families, but we know there are parts of our province where it require government to be continue to provide that support. And Inverness, Mr. Speaker, is not forgotten. Quite frankly, we will continue to work with the good people of Inverness, and I hope the honourable member will continue to work with the department and the minister to ensure that his constituent who is finding themselves in this position today will find a situation that actually works for their family.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I can count 3 private providers who came to the department hoping to get funding who were turned down this year. A housing program that works should be able to keep a mom and her daughter close to the same community where they work and go to school. She could lose her job and her young daughter could lose her friends. It's not very nice. What message does this send to people who are trying their best to participate in the economy and raise a family? These are Nova Scotians we need to keep in their communities because these small communities and the small businesses there need them. Housing Nova Scotia, and by extension this government, should support them. They had 6 months to help them. An apartment in Port Hawkesbury is not a solution. Will the Premier prove this government cares and provide Housing Nova Scotia with what it needs to better manage the affordable housing needs in Inverness and direct them to find a place for this family close to Inverness before their security falls apart?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his question. Mr. Speaker, we continue to work not only with the families in Inverness, but families across this province to continue to provide them with affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, I've laid out a number of options on rent supplements. I said in my first question the amount of money we set aside to invest in our own housing stocks. We continue to work with private developers, continue to make sure that we're providing a myriad of housing options for families. I don't know the specific case the honourable member is referring to, but I can tell you that the minister will look into it and we'll do everything we can, not only to keep this family close to where they are, Mr. Speaker, but all families in our province who are living in communities trying to find themselves in a situation where they need affordable housing. We want to help them.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the minister responsible for seniors. We have heard from families and community organizations about the need for more nursing home beds. Families are concerned that their loved ones are being kept in hospitals instead of receiving proper long-term care. More than 20% of all hospital beds were occupied by alternative level of care patients in 2018. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister, is forcing seniors to stay in hospital beds because there are no long-term care beds available a responsible approach for providing care for seniors?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the Seniors Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. We know that seniors issues and a wide range of them with programs are the purview of the Department of Seniors, and we have a number of programs around age-friendly communities and ways in which we do support seniors through our work. We just this week celebrated the GovLab, which again is coming up with new and innovative ways of supporting seniors in our communities and staying safely in their homes as long as possible.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when seniors are forced to stay in hospital beds instead of being placed in long-term care, they do not have the same quality of life that they would if they were in a proper nursing home. There's no recreation or programming opportunities in hospitals. There are limited opportunities for social interaction. Living in a hospital bed is not good for anyone in the long term, and I've had the experience, Mr. Speaker, to chat with people who are living in hospital beds and are missing out on the social interaction that's provided in long-term care facilities once that is where they need to go. The average total length of stay in a Nova Scotia hospital for an ALC patient is more than 100 days. This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is the minister doing to get seniors out of hospital beds and into proper long-term care facilities?
The Honourable Minister for Seniors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that is one of the challenges that has faced all governments for the last couple of decades. What I do know is that the list for seniors in hospitals has been dramatically cut. I remember the days when there would be 30 patients at Valley Regional. Now it's down to about 10. But what I could really tell the member opposite is that if I were in Cape Breton, I'd be celebrating the new long-term care beds coming to Cape Breton.
The honourable member for Argyll-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. Back in January, the end of January, the government, through its committee with Dr. Drew Bethune, made a decision not to put radiation oncology in the Yarmouth Hospital, which, quite to the dismay of the locals feeling, of course, that that's a service that they could have for those people that have to travel so far here to Halifax to receive that service. My question to the minister is just simply, how are we reacting to that that decision? How is the government going to move forward from that decision of not having radiation oncology in Yarmouth?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do thank the member for the question. I do know that this is a topic of great interest to the constituents in Yarmouth. Certainly my colleague, the Minister of Education, the member for Yarmouth, has brought this issue to the fore. That's why we initiated the review in the first place. The results of the review, which were made public, and myself and Dr. Bethune went to Yarmouth to have the conversations with representatives, and the recommendation did have representatives from the community as well to move forward with enhancing other supports rather than developing the complete cancer centre. That was, after reviewing all of the information, the recommendation of both the clinicians and the community representatives that came forward to work. So those work on the next steps are underway.
The honourable member for Argyll-Barrington.
So, Mr. Speaker, you know what happens is that people with a cancer diagnosis, those who have to go to radiation therapy, you know, make a decision whether they travel here to Halifax or not, whether they continue to treat, or do they accept their fate to go on, and that's a sad discussion to have with anyone's constituent, and it does happen far more, I believe, than we actually know. The enhancements, Mr. Speaker, revolve around psychological support for patients, better coordination of appointments, enhance of telemedicine, uses of radiotherapy technology so that there's fewer appointments, and better solutions for transportation and accommodations. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is just simply, what are the timelines to get some of these things working for our patients?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Work on the next steps in moving forward with those recommendations that were brought forward. I thank the member for reading off the report recommendation summary, because that's exactly what the recommendations were, and we are those next steps and the actions have already started. Dr. Bethune and his team continues with the committee on the clinical work and recommendations, as he mentioned, around psychological supports, the scheduling of appointments and efficiencies there, and so that work is ongoing. And within the government side, we've got the committee established, looking at how we can improve the transportation accommodation work. So again, work started right away and is continuing.
The honourable member for Kings North.
My question, Mr. Speaker, is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, in 2015, a media report highlighted a backlog for hip and knee surgeries in the province. And in last year's budget, investments were made that were supposed to erase wait times and clear the backlog, but it's actually gotten worse. And now at Valley Regional, there's a backlog of 3,030 surgeries, and I'll table both those media reports I've referenced. My question for the Minister of Health is, during his time as Minister, we've seen a steady decline in these important health services, and my question is, what is he going to do about that?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for raising this important question. It's the area of orthopedic surgeries in the province is one that this government has taken seriously. Remind Mr. Speaker, the members of the legislature, that in October of last year, we announced a program that was designed by physicians on the front line, where we tasked them with coming forward with a proposal of how we can properly and successfully attack wait lists and get more surgeries for orthopedics, particularly targeting hips and knees. And Mr. Speaker, I know that has been successful. We've seen about 4,000 additional surgeries being performed each year in our orthopedic services based upon the investments, adding orthopedic surgeons, adding anaesthetists. So we're taking steps, Mr. Speaker, investing heavily to see better outcomes and more surgeries for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister for that answer. A primary reason for the increase in wait times is a lack of an anesthesiologist in the Valley. Pair that with a lack of family doctors and widespread staff shortages in general, and you'll find that both services and staff at the Valley Regional have come under very severe stress. And these positions are advertised, but they continue to go unfilled, and it isn't only at one hospital, it's across the province. My question for the minister is, if the current hiring strategy, which has been in place since the minister was appointed, has not resulted in improved conditions, at what point does the department and the minister come up with a new strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, again, I'd like to thank those frontline healthcare workers that worked on developing this strategy that they brought forward. And I'd like to thank my colleagues who worked, particularly the Minister of Finance, to make sure that we had the money to invest in implementing this plan. And Mr. Speaker, as to whether or not the plan worked, I'd like to refer him to a recent CIHI report that actually reports that our hip fracture repair, 96% of Nova Scotians get their operations within the recommended wait time of 48 hours in 2018. That's an increase, Mr. Speaker, from 85% in 2016 and compares to a national average of only 88% of patients getting their hips fixed within that 48-hour period, Mr. Speaker. And that's 96% are getting that surgery completed within that 48 hours, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, based upon our investments and the good work of our frontline healthcare providers.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a physiotherapist, I know the difference between the wait time if you fall down the stairs and break your hip versus if you're waiting 3 years to get one. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Education knows, Cole Harbour and Auburn High School and the feeder schools have been in a state of limbo since he used one of his first actions as the minister to put our school review process on hold. I have written to the minister, emailed him, spoken to him in this legislature many times on behalf of the students, parents, teachers, staff, and businesses in my community. To date, we have not heard what the minister plans to do with all of these schools. My question is simple to the minister, and I'll table one of the letters that I sent to him. Can the minister now tell me, after almost 2 years since the minister put the school review process on hold, what he plans to do about these schools?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we have indicated publicly, the plan is to have both schools remain open with a new technical focus in the Cole Harbour location. So that has been, that concept broadly has been communicated to the SACs. The member for Cole Harbour has actually been on top of me for this one. This is very important for his community, and we'll continue to work with him and the SAC to find the appropriate model that will ensure that all the students have access to really exciting learning opportunities in both of those facilities.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that response. So I just want to confirm that you're going to leave Cole Harbour High School open. But there were a whole lot of other schools impacted, which is Auburn High School. I'd like to know if he plans on leaving that school open as well. But the residents of those communities are also looking for answers as to what's going to happen to all the elementary schools and the junior high schools, because the SACs put over a year's worth of work into it. Then the school boards put a whole lot of work into it, and we still don't know what's going to happen to the rest of the schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. We haven't landed on a decision point on those yet, but I do want to assure the member, I want to assure the community, we appreciate the hard work that they've put in. All of the information and recommendations that group compiled is informing how we move forward with this, and I want to make sure that the member understands that. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also have a question for the Minister of Education. It's also about an invisible process. School capital planning is one of the areas covered in the Auditor General's recent follow-up report on 2015 and 16 recommendations. The AG found that there was little importance placed on capital planning within the department and recommended that the department establish and follow a consistent and clear process for evaluating capital project requests to support long-term capital planning. This recommendation from 2016, like many others, remains incomplete. Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell this House when he will be able to table the department's clear and transparent process for evaluating school capital requests?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have been working on this for a while. We do want to get this right. The Auditor General's report is helping inform how we move forward. Also, transitioning from the former governance structure, understanding how we're going to receive the operational priorities that come from the regions and categorize them. We're in the process of finalizing that. So I do hope it's sooner rather than later. That is something we've been working on for a bit of time now.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minister for that answer and look forward to that process being tabled in the House when it's complete. Mr. Speaker, in the same report, the AG found that the department had failed to appropriately manage decisions related to P3 schools. The AG recommended that the Department of Education develop and implement a process to assess future P3 decisions that provide sufficient time for all parties to make decisions and incorporates a full assessment of factors, including cost, projected enrollment, and actual future lease rates provided by the developer. This work has been completed, Mr. Speaker, and we know that government is pursuing P3 projects in other departments. Mr. Speaker, will the minister table this process so that we can use it to inform ourselves about how the government's justifying its future P3 decisions? The
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We did do a cost-benefit analysis of the P3 model. We also sought feedback from communities, and we have recognizing that the P3 schools that were built in the 90s are some of our nicest, most well-kept learning spaces in the province. We are purchasing those from the developer. They will belong to the province and communities across this province, including in my own riding. I know the member for Sydney fought to have the P3 school in his riding kept. We'll continue to give great learning experiences to our students.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Approximately 2 weeks ago, I rose to ask the Premier about a letter on the Minister of Health's desk. The intent of the letter is to allow optometrists and ophthalmologists to work together in Cape Breton so that glaucoma patients will be treated at home. This letter has been sitting on the Minister's desk for 4 years. Since the Premier made the commitment, I'd like to follow up and ask, has the Premier found the time to review this letter concerning glaucoma treatment in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I have asked for that correspondence and I have not received it yet.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know a lot of people who are going to be very disappointed to hear that the Premier hasn't had that letter reviewed yet. It's extremely important to Cape Bretoners that they aren't forced to travel for several hours or pay out of pocket for glaucoma treatment. Most of these people can't drive, are unable to drive, or have to have someone to drive them. This government has solutions within reach, but they need to take action and be accountable instead of kicking this can down the road. So I want to ask the Premier, when can those suffering from glaucoma in Cape Breton expect the Premier and the Minister to take the action promised only a few weeks ago?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I promised a few weeks ago that I would look at the letter that the Honourable Member is referring to, Mr. Speaker, and I will assure him that will take place, Mr. Speaker, and he will be able to communicate that back to his constituents.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a number of my constituents are seniors, and they've approached me in regards to dental health for their demographic. Poor dental health, of course, has a huge effect on a person's life, from the ability to eat and maintain proper nutrition, hygiene, affects everything. Mr. Speaker, the government recently announced dental coverage for youth, extension of the youth ages 11 to 14, and considering a recent study by StatsCan, which identified Nova Scotia as the only province in Canada where child poverty actually increased since 2015, I certainly applaud that decision. But with many seniors also living at or below poverty in Nova Scotia, dental coverage is also out of reach for them. My question to the Minister of Health is, does the Minister have a plan similar to that for the extension of dental coverage for seniors that was put in place for youth?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The changes the member refers to was changes based upon work with the Dental Association as to where the priority investments and enhancements to our dental program would be. They had indicated the area that needed the most attention was in enhancing access to preventative services for our youth, and that's why we made the changes in the program that we did. Again, that's in consultation and collaboration with frontline dental service providers.
The honourable member for Sackville Beaver Bank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I guess what I've heard from a number of dentists is a number of them weren't really consulted. In fact, there was they ran into a problem when the extension of coverage came. It actually changed billing codes that the Nova Scotia dentists were using, which caused a lot of problems for a number of dentists. Some of them have actually stopped taking on new children patients, and so I've been told that if we move forward with anything for seniors, they'd actually like to make sure that there's better consultation done. So with seniors desperately needing dental coverage in order for it to be effective, it has to be done right. So I just want to confirm the minister said that he has worked with dentists in regards to the extension of youth coverage. Will the minister work with dentists to find the best way to provide senior dental coverage without negatively impacting the dentists as well?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As with many groups that the government negotiates or interacts with for compensation frameworks and structures, it was the Dental Association with whom we would engage with for moving forward, Mr. Speaker. That's who the agreement is established with, and that's who we consulted. That doesn't mean every dentist, Mr. Speaker, would have been engaged or consulted, but the organization representing them as we move forward with that agreement.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, the lack of internet access and cell phone coverage continues to be one of the largest barriers for economic growth in Cumberland North and throughout all of rural Nova Scotia. The lack of internet access further widens the rural-urban divide. I hear from constituents daily about their frustration of lack of internet access. Kathy and David Bates moved to Malagash area a year ago, and he frequently has to go to a hotel to run his business, his consulting business, because he has no internet access. I have another business in Pugwash that is considering moving to New Brunswick due to their lack of effective and reliable internet access. My question to the Minister of Business is, can he update the House on the timeline for Cumberland North residents and Cumberland North businesses to receive improved infrastructure for high-speed internet?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for the question and welcome her constituent in the gallery who had the petition with respect to broadband. I can tell the member, the folks in the gallery and the constituency and all Nova Scotians, certainly that help is on the way. Again, it's a groundbreaking, pioneering investment of almost $200 million in this program. The challenge was that there was no structure, there was no infrastructure to build out this investment and make sure that it hits the right people at the right time. So what we've committed to, Mr. Speaker, for the member is that we're going to look at the fastest options, satellite, wireless, immediately, which we hope will be by the end of 2019, this calendar year. And after that, we move into the hard wiring, the fiber optic, and that'll obviously be the bulk of the investment. So the program is moving quickly. It's going to be very much based on regional sort of implications. So I'll take back to Develop Nova Scotia the specific issues that the member mentioned today, and we'll see if we can get a specific update on that particular area. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you for the answer, and I think the timeline is really the question, and sometimes our speed of government is too slow for the needs of our people. I do hear from citizens daily. Recently, this week, I heard from a mother of 3 children who face challenges of them getting their schoolwork completed due to the lack of internet access. So it's affecting education, it's affecting health, it's affecting all areas. Many people need internet to communicate with their employer, Many need it to do their banking. It has become essential to the day-to-day lives of people. I do have a letter from a company that's willing to assist in improving bandwidth on existing infrastructure. It has been sent to Develop Nova Scotia, and I will table it for the minister today to take a look at if he doesn't mind. So my question to the minister is, does he understand the sense of urgency for the people throughout all of rural Nova Scotia, and I speak on behalf of the residents of Cumberland North, for the importance of moving this along as fast as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Absolutely. I think that our commitment of the monies that we've set aside for broadband, obviously with a number of social program commitments that we're trying to accomplish here with it while staying in the fiscal envelope that we've put together in terms of 4 consecutive balanced budgets. This is a big investment and it's a big commitment, so we do understand the urgency. It was over a decade ago that Nova Scotians were given the indication that every Nova Scotian would have access to broadband. That was an impossible commitment to maintain then. It's more attainable now by way of technology, but the technology is great and moving quickly, but it doesn't mean anything if you don't have the money. So for us, we do have the money. We put together the finances to make this work, and we're very proud of that. It is going to roll quickly. We get the urgency certainly from a school perspective, health perspective. All those things are real, but the biggest one for us is from an economic development, or one of the biggest ones from an economic perspective, Mr. Speaker. Broadband is the great equalizer, so we'll have rural Nova Scotians compete because broadband will get us there and equalize their opportunities. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of TIR. Recently, a constituent of mine, who was a truck driver, was stopped at the scales in Amherst. He was issued a $180 ticket for having snow on the roof of his truck. He didn't know the snow was there, and he had just passed through Maine and Salisbury, New Brunswick without incident. So we had to pay another $100 to arrange for someone to come to clear the snow, because the snow removal device at the Amherst scales was broken, and apparently has been for approximately 5 years. So my question is, could the minister check into the status of that particular scale, and if still broken, could he put plans in place to have it fixed before next winter?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing this matter forward. I'd be happy to investigate that if you give me the details. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
The thing is, occupational health and safety standards do not allow truckers to remove snow from their trucks on their own. I guess I was wondering, the truck driver was just trying to do his job, and he was assessed a penalty because government equipment wasn't working. So my question is it fair to charge the truck driver when the necessary snow removal equipment wasn't working?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and rest assured that this government really appreciates the contribution that truckers make in our province. They're the front line of our transportation system. They bring our economy. They're an extremely important and often unsung heroes of our economy in the province. And we take it very seriously, what we do, and certainly undertake to see what the issue is there.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today was for the minister responsible for the status of women, but I'm told that the Premier would like to answer my questions, so I won't ask him about period poverty. However, earlier this year, women's centres across the province wrote to the government asking that the 2019-20 budget reflect an investment on the critical services that they provide on issues ranging from poverty, employability, mental health, and sexual violence. So can the Premier please explain why the government ignored the recommendations made by the women's centres of Truro, Antigonish, Every Women's Centre, LEA Place Women's Resource Centre, Pictou County Women's Resource Centre, Second Story Women's Centre, Strait Area Women's Centre, the Women's Place Resource Centre, Tri-County, and Women's Centres Connect.
The honourable member, pardon me, the honourable premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. She's right, Mr. Speaker. The government received a recommendation from women's centres across the province. She would also know from her time in government, Mr. Speaker, that the Straight Women's Centre was not funded at the same level. Their sister organizations were across the province. This budget reflects that we have continued to invest in the Straight area to ensure that they're being funded at the same level as other women's centres across the province. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, this budget will also reflect the fact for the very first time the Nova Scotia Native Women's Association is being funded, Mr. Speaker, with the equivalent amount of money to ensure that we continue to provide supports to these amazing organizations that are providing support to women and families in many of our communities across the province, and we look forward to continuing to work with them to solve those challenges.
The honourable member for Truro, Baba Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. However, women's centres are serving more and more women with really increasingly complex problems. And the staff of these centres have demonstrated incredible skills and expertise on really quite low budgets. So they're looking to government as being their partner. And in spite of multiple requests, they've not been able to meet with the Minister of the Status of Women not once in the past 5 years. So would the Premier apologize to these women's centres and agree that the Minister responsible for the status of women will schedule a meeting before the end of April?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We continue to see women's centres across our province as valuable partners as we continue to provide the supports that women, children and families require in many of our communities. The honourable member is right. They are seeing many, many more complex challenges. We've recognized that. We'll continue to work with them. I'm sure the minister will be happy and the department will be happy to meet with women's centres across the province. I know I'm fortunate to have one in my constituency, Mr. Speaker. Della Longmire and I meet often. I continue to look forward to those meetings, and I will continue to hold those meetings as her MLA, and I will continue to put a voice at the cabinet table to ensure that women's centres are always part of the conversation when we look to building our budgets.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Almost every day, Mr. Speaker, at École Bois-Joli, a school bus is late at that school. And parents and teachers, Mr. Speaker, have indicated to me that these delays are frequent, and some of these delays are up to an hour. Now, in some cases, parents are having to put off work to wait for the late bus, or I'm hearing from teachers that at times they have to adjust their lesson to include these late students up to an hour. And most importantly, students who are missing out, some students are missing out on valuable class time. Mr. Speaker, the frequent occurrence of these late buses is having a negative impact on the classroom. My question is this: what will the minister do to ensure students get to class on time at École Bois-Joli? Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much appreciate the member's comments, and I share his concerns on some of the logistical issues we're still having with our bus service. We have, if the member remembers, we did announce a bus review in the fall. We have compiled feedback from parents, school communities, students from across the province. It's become very clear that we do have a specific issue here in Halifax with the execution of busing duties. So we are developing strategies to deal with that and hopefully see some improvements. Parents deserve it, students deserve it, and we know we need to do better on the busing front, and we're committed to getting there.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the minister recognizes the problems we're having in our busing system, the crisis that exists. It's too bad they won't recognize that in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, parents in our province, they simply want their children to get to school on time. They want them there to the school safely. It's a very basic, fundamental responsibility of the education system, a responsibility, Mr. Speaker, that the province has failed to deliver, especially at the beginning of this academic year. Now, I'm sure many members in this House remember running to catch the school bus, but this government leaves some families in Dartmouth East stranded at the stop. My question is this: will the minister commit to improving quality of school transportation strategies and ensure buses arrive on time at their destination? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And yes, absolutely. Although, right, as a former English major, we oftentimes misuse the word crisis in this chamber. I do want to recognize that I do not share the members' view that this is a crisis. We have pressures, we have challenges. That does not constitute a crisis in any stretch of the imagination. Thank you. Not for help.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, with less than a minute left, I'd like to ask the Department of Transportation Minister to give me an update, and all those here present and people in my constituency, on the mitigation for the flooding that continues to happen on the Loch Lomond Road that he gave me assurances that would be fixed actually last year.
Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And along with an overall view that we have in the department to the challenge that climate change brings in our coastal areas in terms of impacting our highway system, the matter that the member brings up is being reviewed.
Order,
engineering
please.
work.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to